Chapter 26. Sam walked slowly down to the dock, Brant at her side. Soldier hobbled behind them. Moses, moving much slower, brought up the rear. Sam wouldn't want it any other way. She tried not to dwell on the events of that night. She didn't remember much, and that's the way she wanted to keep it. She'd been rushed to the hospital, where the doctors had frantically stopped the bleeding wound at her throat, while trying to stop the spread of the poison from the cocktail of drugs guaranteed to kill her. If it hadn't been for Brant, she would have died. Chills ran down her spine at the reminder. It had been late the next day before she'd surfaced, screaming. Brant had been at her side, a place he'd stayed during the first week of her recovery. Once out of hospital, they'd enjoyed the time alone at the lake. A healing time. But then he'd had to return to work. Sam had returned to the clinic soon afterward. Even there, she refused to talk about the events, hoping the chatter would die down, and with time it had. Still, David, a good family man and an off-duty cop pulling extra time, lost his life when he'd stepped outside for a cigarette. He'd wandered out to the porch and never had a chance to draw his first smoke-filled breath. The dogs had been rushed to the vet clinic, where they'd both undergone surgery. Thank God the vets had done it for free. Sam didn't have that kind of money, and although Brant had joked that his department should pay the dogs' medical costs, she didn't want to ask for it. She didn't know what the future held, although more people than she'd ever thought possible stopped her on the street to ask what she saw in their futures. Her fame as a psychic had spread after the details of the attack had leaked to the press. Speaking of leaks, Dylan had been reprimanded and transferred to another station. As for Deputy Brooker, Brant had matched shells picked up from the woods around her place to the deputy's gun finally. Brooker had followed Brant to her place, when Soldier had caught his scent in the woods. His truck was the same as the one who'd tried to run her off the road. He wasn't admitting anything more at this point. She didn't know what he would be charged with at the end of the ongoing investigation, yet she could count on Brant to make sure he'd be out of commission for a long time. Sam had agreed to testify and to help their case in any way. She wasn't looking forward to seeing Brooker face to face, only knew she could do it and survive. She was stronger now in many ways. Captain Johansson had apologized profusely. Every time he saw her, in fact. He'd even thanked her. Who knew how long William Durant would have continued killing women, if not for her visions? She could grin at the captain now. It had taken a while, but she was slowly getting used to being around people. Brant had helped with that. So too had Maisie, Brant's mother. The colonel had recovered. He'd recognized the ring as being on the hand of the dog handler who brought the animals in to visit the patients at the center. A very subdued Maisie confessed that the dog handler had been there when she'd established the betting pool on when the colonel would remember what he'd forgotten about the ring. She'd actually asked Bill if he wanted in on the bets. That had sealed the colonel's fate, or nearly. Even Soldier's story might have been connected. Although chances were they'd never know for sure. The dog had certainly known what to do when the time had come. William Durant didn't survive surgery. Sam found it hard to care. The world was better off without him, and this way Sam didn't have to go through 2 trials. Brant was backtracking the guy's life, searching for links to other murders in his files. He was hoping for evidence to close dozens of cases, not to mention bring closure to dozens of families. It would take some time. As a dog trainer, Bill had exposure to people, elderly care homes, and even the hospital, where he took animals to visit with the patients. This allowed him to travel to various locations without raising suspicion. Teaching obedience training gave him access to hundreds of women. An opportunity he'd taken full advantage of. Louise Enderby's longtime partner had come forward after seeing the news. He'd been on the board for the city's animal shelters. He'd fired William from a part-time job at the Pound, where he was to rehabilitate last-ditch cases. He'd been caught abusing the animals instead. probably where William had first crossed paths with Soldier. As an organization that relied heavily on donations, the Pound didn't want any negative publicity, and had agreed not to press charges if Bill disappeared for good. The police could only speculate, yet it appeared that Louise had become an innocent victim of a war she didn't even know about. The best that Sam could understand, Bill picked his victims out of numerous loving couples, where the man had been supposedly considered to be the best man, theoretically underlining that Bill himself wasn't good enough. Sam didn't understand the psychology of it all. Who could understand a twisted mind like his? Who would want to? Stefan had even shown up at her cabin during her first week of convalescence at home, threatening to do her serious harm if she ever got herself in that situation again. Said it had cost him 10 years off his life. He'd also moved her training schedule earlier to avoid a repeat of this mess. Sam smiled. Stefan was a special man, and she loved knowing he was in her life. They had a closeness that she had never known was possible. She could only imagine it was similar to the relationship between twins. As for her and Brant, well, they were slowly adjusting to life as a couple. They both had things to learn, and Sam wasn't sure she was ready to live together, although the topic was under discussion. At the same time, she didn't sleep nearly as well alone. Not that she had the chance to. Brant refused to sleep alone. According to him, he was planning on always waking up with her beside him. She hoped he meant it. She wanted to believe in a happily ever after. Her visions wouldn't ever stop, but she'd become accustomed to them. It wasn't about accepting them any longer, it was about understanding and utilizing them. Progress. Her visions didn't make her an easy partner, then Brant's job wouldn't be easy on her either. They'd work it out. For the first time ever, she could see a future. It was bright and rosy. She'd like to have a vision that told her Brant was her future, and that she'd be spending the next 40 years happily at his side, but as she'd found out, visions didn't work that way. Brant glanced at Sam, standing at his side, staring out over the water. He couldn't help but feel protective of this woman, so slight, so strong, and so damaged. She'd been a tormented soul, who walked with one foot on the dark side of the universe. Now there was a lightness to her. She was everything to him. He stepped closer, wrapping his arms protectively around her shoulders. He'd do anything to keep her safe. In this world and the next. They were a matched set. Their future wouldn't be the standard 2-story house and white picket fence kind of life. No. But it would have its own rewards. And he would make sure they received each and every one of them.